Uh, I should say from the start that I'm giving this talk from the perspective of New York. Obviously, New York is only one of a number of major UN centers. And I think it's worth acknowledging that actually some of Trump's early moves to weaken the multilateral system were targeted elsewhere. On day one of his presidency, he announced the US would pull out of the World Health Organization, which is based in Geneva. I get the feeling, talking to colleagues who are based in Geneva, that actually they have been suffering from a lot of budget cuts even sooner and even more severely than parts of the UN in New York. But I haven't been there in person since January. So I'm going to be giving this talk primarily on the basis of what I see here in Manhattan. Okay, so how bad is it? Well, I think we always knew after President Trump's re-election that his return to office would be a disruptive moment for the UN system. And we knew that because his first term was already pretty disruptive. He took a series of steps to weaken the UN between 2017 and 2020, including pulling out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, pulling out of the UN Human Rights Council, and boycotting a number of other UN treaties and arrangements. And, as of November last year, everyone assumed that he would do that again. And no one was especially surprised when, back in January, he announced that once again he would quit the Paris Agreement and some of the other mechanisms that he had pulled out of first time around. But I have to say, I don't think that members of the UN community were prepared for quite how broad and quite how deep the US attack on the UN system would be. Because what we have seen over the last weeks is the US cutting off funding to parts of the UN, or at least freezing funding to parts of the UN that it had not really touched negatively first time around. So we have seen severe funding shocks to the World Food Programme. We have seen the Trump administration attacking UNICEF for promoting diversity. And these are bodies that traditionally US administrations, including Republican administrations, have liked. Actually, Elise Stefanik, who for a time was the US nominee to be ambassador to the UN, was quite complimentary about the World Food Programme when she had her confirmation hearing. She was quite complimentary about UNICEF. She said they served US interests, and yet still funding has been at least significantly reduced to these bodies. The UN as a whole has been really hit by American financial cuts, and that means that as of today, every office in the UN Secretariat is under instruction to work with about 80% of the budget that had previously been projected. Some of the funds and agencies that are reliant on US voluntary funding have been even worse affected. We've seen reports of UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, having to lay off thousands of staff. I understand that the World Health Organization, which the US is now boycotting completely, is looking at up to 40% staff cuts. This is a level of damage far, far beyond anything that we experienced between 2017 and 2020. The system, I think, has stumbled in its initial response to this range of budget cuts. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, was aware, and I think was very concerned last year, that the US would initiate a financial storm around the UN. And actually last year, he asked his financial advisors to draw up a budget showing that the UN Secretariat could continue core functions through 2025 and into 2026, even without any US money. But beyond that, there was very little in the way of preparations. And so everyone has been caught on the back foot. Everyone has been essentially just going onto the internet, seeing what the US is cutting today or what they're freezing today, and trying to stay on top of the news. In the last few weeks, we have seen the UN leadership begin to get a bit more of a grip on the situation. I think that in February and early March, a series of officials from major donors to the organization, such as Germany, came through New York and told Guterres that he had to raise his game and he had to start demonstrating a strategic response to the US challenge. And a few weeks ago, Guterres announced that he was putting together a team to do a full-scale review of the UN's mandates and of areas where the UN could make significant savings. That's called the UN 80 project, referring to the fact that this is the UN's 80th birthday year, 8 decades on from the San Francisco Treaty. That team will make some proposals, I believe, in the summer, but I think they're still at a very early stage of working out what their terms of reference are. So it's all a period of shock. I think, one question, though, that no one really has an answer to is there a US strategy guiding all these cuts? Is there a US vision of the UN guiding all these cuts? Or is the US simply acting as a wrecker for the sake of wrecking? Which would, if we're honest, parallel a lot of what the administration has done in Washington with the way it treated USAID and a lot of other US government departments like the Department of Education. One reason that no one has a very clear answer to that question is that there has been no senior Trump representative in New York for all this period. Elise Stefanik, who's a congresswoman from upstate New York, was nominated to be the US ambassador to the UN in November. She had her confirmation hearing in the Senate on the 21st of January, and in essence, from January until a few days ago, everyone was waiting for Stefanik to turn up. And everyone was hoping that, although Stefanik was known to be very hardline, very critical of the UN, that she would at least come to New York and say to other ambassadors and say to the Secretary General, there is a plan. And, the US has certain goals and, if you are willing to compromise with us on those goals, then we will rein in some of the damage that we are doing to the institution. But Stefanik was held up. Her seat is important to the Republicans in Congress, and ultimately she elected to drop her nomination to be US ambassador to the UN and to stay in Congress because of the importance of holding on to that seat. And so suddenly we don't even have a nominee to be the US ambassador to the UN, and ambassadors from other countries are stuck in limbo, just waiting and wondering when a senior figure who actually can speak for Trump will come to New York, because then at least you could start to understand where all this is headed. Just to reinforce the sense that there really is no top-level management of US-UN relations, the senior official for international organizations in the National Security Council, someone called Maggie Doherty, was fired last week as part of an internal cull of US officials who were not deemed to be loyal enough to Trump. So there really is no one in the chain between the president and the US mission to the UN who has any seniority. What's happening in the meantime is that mid-level officials, some of them political, some of them civil service members, are, as far as we can tell, just looking for opportunities to show their loyalty to the US agenda by taking kicks and taking swipes at parts of the UN system. So the mid-level US officials are repeatedly going out of their way to insist that the UN doesn't refer to diversity or sustainability or equality in any of its documents. And they're turning those language issues into topics for really intense diplomatic arguments, sometimes stopping agreements that would otherwise be routine. But again, there's no real sense that this is part of a plan. It just feels like, bureaucrats trying to do whatever they think President Trump might like them to do in any given process on any given day. I should say that there are also some US officials who are clearly very pained by what they're being forced to say, what they're being forced to do. We have heard stories of actually some US officials shedding a tear while reading out some of the most outrageous statements from the US. But I think others are just trying to get along because they're concerned about their own jobs and they're trying to follow the agenda that they think the president would want. Trump himself has, he has referred repeatedly to the fact that he doesn't think the UN is performing very well, but that he thinks that it could be a great institution. But he has never, either in his first term or in this term, demonstrated sort of any real interest in the organization or how the organization works. He has said, and people like Marco Rubio and Elise Stefanik have repeated, that he thinks that the UN should focus more narrowly on international peace and security, that it should go back to its founding mission of preserving international peace and security. But again, it's not entirely clear what he means by that. We did get a bit of a hint in February when there was a sort of scandalous moment when the US refused to support a resolution drafted by Ukraine and the European Union marking the 3rd anniversary of Russia's all-out war against Ukraine. And the US not only opposed that resolution, but actually worked with Russia in the Security Council to pass a resolution endorsing the current US-Russia talks. You can interpret that, if you're generous, as showing that Trump wants to restore a degree of great power cooperation through the Security Council, that he believes that the Security Council and the UN as a whole should go back to the 1945 vision of a few big powers sort of managing international cooperation. And since the Ukraine votes, we have actually seen the Russians and the US cooperating on a few other files in the Council, including Syria and Bosnia, both of which were areas where they were previously divided. But I think it is a little hard to extrapolate from that that Trump has a very clear vision himself of the UN as a great power deconfliction mechanism. I suspect that this cooperation is really just a side effect of the bilateral talks that are taking place between the US and the Russians. It's an easy way to signal goodwill. I don't think that it adds up to a pointer to how Trump thinks he can run the UN in future. So here we are. We don't have any money. We don't really have any idea of what the US wants out of the UN. And we don't know when anyone is going to turn up to tell us that. And so everyone is in the dark and everyone is guessing. I think right now there are 3 schools of thought about the UN, around the UN, about how to live with the Trump administration. There is still a pragmatic school of thought, and this is very common amongst diplomats in New York who care about the organization, that ultimately the madness will fade out. And there is a hope that if UN member states and the UN Secretary General can table a series of cost-saving reforms, can find ways to demonstrate that the UN is in the US interest, then eventually the Trump administration will calm down. It may restore some funding to parts of the UN which it has defunded, and although it will not be an easy relationship, it may be possible to find a degree of accommodation with Washington. People who believe that, I think, also point to the fact that there are some areas where the UN could be genuinely useful to the Trump administration's agenda. For example, if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, you might need some sort of peacekeeping force to monitor the operation between Russian and Ukrainian forces. Now, this would be separate to what European leaders have been talking about, which is a deterrence force consisting of European troops. That is one sort of military operation. But you might want a UN peacekeeping force that could sort of handle incidents on the line of control and facilitate communications between the Russians and Ukrainians. And that's an option which is being kicked around at UN headquarters. And it is possible that down the road, the Trump administration will, come to the Security Council with a ceasefire proposal and actually ask for the UN to help with verifying it. Similarly, the Trump administration is yet to do anything real about the level of chaos in Haiti. The Biden administration was very concerned about the level of chaos in Haiti, and by the end of Biden's time, the view in the White House was that you needed another UN peacekeeping force, a blue helmet force, to deploy to Haiti to restore order. Now, the Trump administration has not said anything along those lines. It hasn't indicated what its policy towards Haiti really is. But it's conceivable that actually, in a non-ideological fashion, the US will conclude that peacekeeping is a pretty good option for Haiti. And so suddenly Trump might give his blessing to quite a large deployment with Latin American troops and other troops in the Caribbean. And so the optimists say, if we can get some reforms right, if we can merge some UN agencies, if we can find some crises where the UN is useful, then we'll get Trump on side. And everyone is also, looking forward to September, because in September we have the high-level week where the US president and other world leaders come to New York. And if there's one thing we know about Trump and the UN, it's that he enjoys the high-level week. This was very, very obvious in 2017 through 2019. He really, he sucks up the audience of other leaders he gets. He enjoys the theater of the UN. And so again, the optimists say, well, look, he'll come here in September, he'll feel positive because other leaders will be nice to him, and that will make him feel warm towards the UN. Now, that is quite a big bet. I'm not sure that a lot of leaders do want to be nice to President Trump right at the moment. But nonetheless, perhaps for diplomatic reasons they would be. So that's the optimistic take. The pessimistic take is that none of this is true. That the Trump administration just does not care. It has demonstrated that it is not concerned by humanitarian issues, that it is not concerned by issues like global health, and it will pocket whatever reforms it is offered at the UN, but it will just continue to take kicks at the institution because it serves certain domestic political purposes. And it's worth saying that, there is a deep-seated mistrust of the UN in the Congressional Republican Party, and I think in the Republican Party at large. And it may just be easier for the administration to keep on satisfying that domestic dislike for the UN by taking further kicks at the institution. Again, it's very hard to know if that's the case until you have some senior US representation in New York who can be dealt with. But the pessimists say that this sort of idea that there's a pragmatic meeting point with Trump is overstated. It's treating him too much like a normal administration. And if you look at Trump's tariff policies, if you look at his language around the tariff policies over the last few days, you don't get the impression that this is a man who's enormously concerned about maintaining the world system. He just doesn't seem to care. And then there's a final school of thought, so that are the optimists, the pessimists, and then there's a final school of thought, which I think is the nihilist reading of Trump, which is that it's not that he just doesn't care about the UN, but that he is actively opposed to and actively wishes to undermine some of the core principles of the organization. And that is based not only on funding freezes, that is based not only on short-term policy decisions in New York, it's based on a reading of what he's saying about certain issues. I mean, Trump's repeated declarations of interest and implications that he would use force to take over Greenland and maybe even Canada runs directly counter to elements of the UN Charter. He seems to have a fairly 19th century pre-UN vision of the world, and it is conceivable that his administration will take steps that will basically render the UN Charter a dead letter. And that is a real source of concern to some diplomats here in New York. There are other diplomats who just find Trump's positions on issues such as race as fundamentally counter to decades of UN practice and decades of UN principle. And they see this as an administration that is actively out to end the key parts of the UN order. In their bleaker moments, people will say that they could imagine the US leaving the UN. I have to say that I think that in the short to medium term, that remains unlikely. I think that if nothing else, the US understands that it needs to sit in the Security Council with its veto to protect Israel in particular from international criticism. And I think there is an understanding actually in Republican circles that if the US were to leave the UN, that would create an open goal for China to increase its influence in the multilateral system. And so I don't think that the US is going to go that far. Equally, I don't think that the US is going to invade New Brunswick anytime soon. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it will, and that will be a world historical moment that we profoundly hope to avoid. What I think is probably more likely is that the pragmatists are half right and the pessimists are half right. I think the pessimists are right to say that there's no fundamental US interest on the part of this administration in sort of propping up any particular version of the UN. I think that it is a lot of its wrecking behavior is wrecking for its own sake. However, I do also think the pragmatists may have a point. The Trump administration, is going to encounter reality. It is going to face crises, and even if it may not instinctively want to work through the UN system, there probably will be cases such as Haiti where ultimately it finds that it has to. But I think that's going to be a bumpy ride before we get to that moment of clarity. And I think that if there is a moment of clarity, it's going to keep on being bumpy because we have a US that is simply not bound by a lot of the assumptions and a lot of the core guiding principles that have governed US engagement with the multilateral system, even in periods such as the period around the Iraq War, when Washington was feeling very, very negative towards New York. So that's the damage assessment. It's not pretty. I'm told that there is only one UN center where people are quite happy at the moment, and that is Nairobi, because a large number of UN staff are being moved to Nairobi. Officials there think that they may be soon housing even more UN staff because Various UN agencies may find that it is easier to operate out of Kenya than it is to operate out of the US. And so perhaps that's Trump's really long-term contribution to the UN system, which is to finally shift its center of gravity to a city in the global south and away from the eastern seaboard of the US.